Okay, here is our quick introduction and review of the basics of Keynesianism and John Maynard Keynes' kind of overall influence on the way we think about the economy. So this chart is the same chart that was in our notes, and I would recommend you make a copy of it somewhere. It has some good basics and some good kind of starting points for each of the things we need to do. So let's start with the first three boxes over here, and then we'll get over to graphing a little bit, or kind of intersperse. So first, Keynes is a strong believer in the importance of the short run. And he's an important believer in the short run in particular leads to price stickiness and especially wage stickiness. And when you start to think about that idea of price and wage stickiness, it means that when prices begin to move, when prices begin to increase in the economy, when there's inflation, that doesn't apply to all prices evenly, that some prices, especially wages, the price of labor, responds slower than other prices. So that idea gives Keynes the unique shape of the supply curve that we come to call the short-run aggregate supply curve. And really the short-run aggregate supply curve is this Keynesian aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping. And we've talked before about how the short-run aggregate supply curve gets its shape because of that stickiness of prices overall. So that upward sloping supply curve leads to a market that Keynes says is actually relatively unstable and kind of tends to fluctuation in both output and unemployment. And what we really mean here is that there is no perfect or maximum level of output along this supply curve as compared to our vertical or long run aggregate supply curve, which we mark as potential. The economy can bounce really anywhere along this supply curve, and in bouncing along that supply curve can create different levels of output, and those different levels of output correlate to different levels of unemployment. And that all comes together for Keynes, who believes that the key side of the market is aggregate demand, aka the spending side of the market. C plus I plus G plus XN. And so what Keynes is really saying here is that this short run curve, because of stickiness, is kind of fixed in its position at any given moment. But what's not fixed is how people and governments spend their money. And so we can see that a key factor in determining the level of output in this economy is where this aggregate demand curve falls. And as people spend less, output falls and therefore unemployment will rise. But as output increases, when people spend more, then output can go up and unemployment can go down. And so these demand curves are the kind of key parts of this market. That really for Keynes, again, means that in the short run, productivity cannot change dramatically based on the supply curve, but that what individuals and businesses do, those elements of demand, are the driving factor. Keynes very famously described the spending of businesses in particular as being reliant on their animal spirits. And really this is a reference to business expectations, that when businesses feel strong and feel powerful and feel motivated, they increase their expenditures and the economy drives forward, and that when they don't feel as strong, when they rev down their expenditures, then the economy begins to slow down. We'll add two more pieces here really quickly, as this is just our introductory level of this. The impact of savings. Keynes says that when people increase their savings, this can lead to a decrease in spending. Not necessarily every time, but it can if it's in that one-to-one trade-off. I have $1 and I choose to save it instead of spend it, which can ultimately hurt the short-run output of the economy. When we put all of this together, though, the most important part about Keynes and the conclusion we get to with Keynes is that government intervention is not only exceptionally effective, but also necessary in an economy. Because a government via taxes and monetary policy can influence C and I, can influence the spending of households and businesses, and governments via their own spending, G, can influence aggregate demand as well. So we can see this also on the graph that if we were in a recession at point Y1, that to get to Y2, all we need is an increase in government spending, or potentially a decrease in taxes, or an increase in the money supply and a decrease in interest rates as monetary policy goes. And that will drive aggregate demand to the right and drive the economy to produce more and push unemployment down. For Keynes, this is especially effective in these lowest levels of output, at lowest levels of Y, which Keynes calls the spare capacity areas of the economy. And spare capacity means exactly what it sounds like, that eventually this economy in these kind of lower areas of output, we have so many people who are unemployed, we have so many people who are, or businesses that are not spending, that the government must come in and replace business spending and consumer spending. And the final conclusion we can make with that in spare capacity to a Keynesian, there is no such thing as crowding out. Because if I'm not spending, then the government can spend to replace my spending, and that government spending is not going to push me out. And some of these concepts are going to make more sense again if you've already learned about crowding out, or if we go ahead and watch the next video on classical economics. But this fear that a government spending is going to bump someone else out of the way does not exist in the Keynesian model, because at these lowest levels of output and at these highest levels of unemployment, there's no spending to bump out of the way. We'll talk about later. Keynes does believe, though it's not super critical to this model, he does believe that at certain higher levels of output, of course, it would be impossible to spend more without beginning to bump some production out of the way. But at the low levels of output, that just doesn't seem to be the case. If businesses aren't spending, then the government clearly can. If we want to wrap this up and give a quick summary here, you're not going to see the word Keynesian used a lot on the actual AP exam, but you are going to see hints of Keynesian analysis. You're going to get hints that we're thinking about the short run. You're going to see hints that the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. You're going to see hints that they talk about price and wage stickiness, or they might even talk about exceptionally high levels of unemployment or exceptionally low levels of output. And all of these are indicators that the question is saying, think from a Keynesian perspective. Does government spending work when we're in the short run? Does government spending work when aggregate supply is upward sloping? Does government spending work when there is spare capacity? And the answer to all of those from the Keynesian perspective is that yes, government spending can work. And to round this out, even Keynes's biggest critics have largely come around to acknowledge that Keynes has added a level of depth to the analysis of the economy, especially in this idea of the short run. And the very famous line is that we are all Keynesians now. In other words, even those who don't like government policy as a solution to economic problems, acknowledge that especially in the extreme short run, there is some level of accuracy, some level of truth that a government could, of course, come in and create these bursts of economic activity. And that could create a solution, at least in the very short run. What tends to be the debate now is how long into the future will those solutions continue to be effective, aside from in the absolute worst situations.